Good evening. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and AT&T, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe and WBUR. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to explore the life of Nancy Reagan with our distinguished guests this evening. I am now delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. I'm so pleased to welcome Karen Tumulty back to the library virtually this evening. She is a columnist for the Washington Post, where in her previous role as a national political correspondent for the newspaper, she received the Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting. She has also served as a national political, White House, and congressional correspondent for Time magazine and covered a wide variety of beats for the Los Angeles Times. She is the author of the new book, The Triumph of Nancy Reagan, which we'll be discussing tonight. I'm also delighted to welcome Eileen McNamara, our moderator for this evening's discussion, back to the library virtually. She is professor of the practice of journalism at Brandeis University and an award-winning former reporter and columnist for the Boston Globe, where she won an individual Pulitzer Prize for commentary and contributed to the newspaper's Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of the clergy sex abuse scandal of the Archdiocese of Boston. Her writing continues to appear there and on Cognoscenti, the commentary pages of WBUR.org, Boston's national public radio station. She is also the author of Eunice, the Kennedy Who Changed the World. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Thank you, Rachel. It is great to be on a program with my old friend, Karen. Even if it is only virtually, it's delightful to be here. This is going to be a wonderful, expansive conversation because it turns out that Nancy has as much to do with American foreign policy as she does with expensive China. And so I'm going to start there saying to the audience, Karen and I go way back. We go all the way back to the Reagan administration, and we did not cover the First Lady. Karen was at the LA Times and I was at the Boston Globe covering Congress during the Reagan years. And I would have said until I read your book, Karen, that I knew Nancy Reagan. And I knew that she did have a taste for expensive placewear settings, and that she liked designer fashion, that she said, just say no. And she had a penchant for astrology. So that's not exactly who Nancy Reagan is, right? I learned that in your book.
Well, she was all of those people, but she was so much more than that. I worked on this book for 4.5 years. Simon & Schuster came to me. I'd never written a book before. Simon & Schuster came to me shortly after she died, the fall of 2016, and said, we'd like a book on Nancy Reagan. Do you want to write it? And, I was just terrified about the prospect of writing a book. So I thought, well, let's see if I can do this. But it was really after a couple of years of research that I began to realize that writing a book about Nancy Reagan was not the same thing as writing this book about Nancy Reagan. And that as the pieces of her very, very complex personality and life fall together, and again, she had her flaws, she had her demons. I do not shy from any of those in this book. In fact, I uncover some fresh ones. But I also realized that if I could pull this off the kind of book I wanted this to be, that it would be a new way of looking at the rise of one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century, of the shaping of his presidency, and ultimately the shaping of Ronald Reagan's legacy. Because Nancy Reagan was very, very much a partner in this, and not just as her husband's advisor. Ronald Reagan was a very unique, very solitary figure. She was quite literally the only person in the world to whom he was close. And she said, sometimes even I feel that barrier. Mm-hmm. So it really did fall to her. She had, as James Baker told me, she had much better instincts about people than he did. So it falls to her to become, in many ways, his protector, his guardian. She rarely set foot in the West Wing, but if she was unhappy about something, everybody there knew it. And if somebody was not in her favor, they tended not to last for very long. She's one of the main reasons Ronald Reagan went through a half dozen national security advisors. But for the people on her husband's, in his orbit, who were shrewd enough to understand how important an ally she could be, and two of them I would count among first and foremost of this, who talked to me quite a bit, were James Baker, the White House Chief of Staff, and George Shultz, recently deceased, who was Reagan's Secretary of State. She could prove to be an invaluable ally.
Invaluable. And yet she would have protested at the time that, she didn't get involved in policy and she didn't care about policy. And I don't know if you agree, but I sort of had the feeling that that was a reaction to Rosalind Carter, who had sort of invited herself to cabinet meetings, which put quite a lot of people off, including people in the cabinet meeting. You open your book with an extraordinary anecdote about a dinner party in the private residence at the White House with George Shultz. And I think it speaks to that dichotomy between what she says she does to support her husband and the profound influence that she actually has. Could you share that story with me?
Sure. She would always say, I don't get involved in policy. I just get involved with people issues. Well, anybody who's been in Washington for 30 seconds knows that determining who is in the room when there is advice to be given or a decision to be made can preordain the outcome. So the story that George Shultz told me, he was 97 years old when he told me this story, was of a blizzard that hit Washington in February of 1983. The whole city is socked in and just beginning to dig itself out. George Shultz, brand new as Secretary of State, he's been there 7 months. He really doesn't know the Reagans all that well. He just barely beat the blizzard getting back into town. He had been on a trip to China. So that Saturday afternoon, he gets this phone call from the First Lady, and she says, why don't you and your wife come over to dinner tonight? It'll just be the four of us. So Shultz shows up, thinks this is a social evening, until out of nowhere, both Reagans start pounding him with questions about the Chinese. What are they like as people? Do they have a sense of humor? Do they have a bottom line? Can you find their bottom line? And from there, Ronald Reagan starts talking about the Soviet Union and all of his ideas for engaging them, about his belief in his own strengths as a negotiator. This is quite a surprise to Shultz, because what he knows of Ronald Reagan is that he has had decades of hardline anti-communist rhetoric, that except for Shultz, his administration is populated by these hawkish figures who believe there could never be anything such as a working relationship with Moscow. He is presiding over the biggest peacetime military buildup in history. But Shultz says it suddenly dawns on him, this guy has never had a conversation with a big-time communist leader, and he is dying to have one. And Nancy is dying for him to have one. And that is also the moment he realizes that this was not a social dinner.
No.
That Nancy wanted to get him alone with the president so that he could begin to understand something fundamental about Ronald Reagan that had the potential to change history. And he also begins to realize that, as he put it, Nancy Reagan was a very important ally to have. As George Shultz told me, I figured out anybody with any brains would make friends with the first lady. She and her husband, really believes that it is his place in history to go down as a peacemaker, not a warmonger. She thinks it's smart politics. You know, the 84 elections coming up, and as much as people like him, they are a little worried he's a little too quick on the nuclear trigger. And she also understands something that people around her husband, most of them don't, that is, along with this hardline anti-communism, there really is this idealism really rooted in the Bible and Reagan's belief in Armageddon, that he believes there could be such a thing as a world without nuclear weapons. She pushes this and pushes it. They're a real married couple. They actually get into arguments, for instance, over his hardline rhetoric. She hated the phrase that he used, evil empire. And Reagan acknowledges, Nancy tried to get me to dial it back, but I thought it worked. And shortly after this dinner with Shultz, Stu Spencer, who's Reagan's oldest political advisor, is there for dinner. And the Reagans are just going at it over the president's use of the phrase evil empire. And finally, Reagan's getting tired of his wife being on his case about this. And he turns to Stu and he says, well, Stu, what do you think? And Stu says, well, yeah, they're an evil empire, but that was kind of tough. And at which point Reagan just says, what's for dessert?
Wow. So you can understand Shultz being surprised. I mean, all the public rhetoric coming out of Ronald Reagan was pretty bellicose. So the notion that he was seeing himself in relationship to the Soviet Union as a negotiator, I think would have been stunning for the Secretary of State. And he was new in the job, right? He'd only been in the job like 7 months.
And for the first few years of the Reagan administration, right after he got shot, he writes this very idealistic letter to Brezhnev saying, we are the only two guys who could bring about world peace. The State Department is horrified by this 6-page handwritten letter. And they try to rewrite it. And they said, this is not the language of diplomacy. But what happens is, one by one, 3 Soviet leaders die on him. I mean, they were ill. It really is finally when the Kremlin makes this generational U-turn, and instead of picking another sick old man, they turn to Mikhail Gorbachev, that he finally finds the negotiating partner that he's been looking for. And certainly Nancy also pushes for that first summit to happen. She's just really, and again, a lot of people in the Reagan administration were reluctant about the summit itself, about how big the agenda should be, but she just won't let it, she won't let go of it.
And of course, that's understandable, right? He rises to prominence in politics as a cold warrior. I mean, his anti-communism is the backbone of who he is, or has been all the way through his political career. So, of course, there's a little bit of shock there among his advisors, and his policy advisors are divided, right? We have these real hardliners that she's trying to hold back so that other part of him that you're talking about can come out.
You see it in the oral histories. Caspar Weinberger, again, an implacable Soviet foe, says in the oral histories, she trusted his abilities as a negotiator. She was much more willing to trust the Soviets than a lot of us were. She essentially engages in an internal war against one of Reagan's more hardline national security advisors, William Clark, who also is at war with Shultz, but Nancy's on Shultz's side. Ultimately, Clark leaves. But again, you do see that the role of national security advisor keeps changing in the Reagan administration, in no small part because of Nancy Reagan.
Right. So she's so much for, I'm not interested in policy. I'm not part of it. She's also, a backstairs at the White House kind of influence. She's maneuvering about who stays and who goes. And some of the choices that she makes in terms of where her loyalties lie seem surprising. She's got sort of two personas as she's going in to the second term of the Reagan administration. She was, what did Gloria Steinem famously call her? The marzipan wife, right? Because of the adoring gaze she always cast on her husband. But she's also going into the second administration seen as Lady Macbeth, because she's engineering the firings of all these people.
She's one of the most surprising choices. People don't realize this now. James Baker, as White House Chief of Staff, was a surprising, almost shocking choice to become Reagan's first Chief of Staff. He too did not know the Reagans very well. In fact, he had known them mostly as an adversary. He had been the chairman of Gerald Ford's campaign in this brutal 1976 Republican primary race against Reagan. He had been George H.W. Bush's closest friend and advisor during, again, a brutal primary contest in 1980. Everyone assumes the White House Chief of Staff is going to be Edwin Meese III, who goes back with Reagan to California. Meese himself is circulating organization charts and memos. Right. And it really is, as Baker told me, when the Reagans decide to go to somebody much less ideological, much more pragmatic, somebody they don't know all that well, with James Baker, Baker told me that Nancy Reagan really was the deciding factor in that. Baker would become very controversial with the ideologues who claimed he was not letting Reagan be Reagan. In the second term, he's completely burned out. So he swaps jobs with Don Reagan, who was the Treasury Secretary, different character. And that's the point at which Michael Deaver, her closest ally, who was deputy chief of staff, there had been this awkward kind of what they call the troika in the White House of Deaver, Baker, and Ed Meese. It didn't work all that well.
Right. You need one chief of staff, not three.
Right.
Right.
In fact, William Clark, who had been the national security advisor, who was not in her favor, in one of his oral histories, says the real troika in the White House was Baker, Deaver, and Nancy.
She reminds me, after reading your book, of no one so much as Bobby Kennedy. That, ruthless is often a word that's ascribed to him, and I see it in your book ascribed to her, but it's ruthless on behalf of Ronald Reagan's image. And she was astute about knowing what would work for him when even some of his closest advisors did not. How was she so tone deaf about her own image?
This is really one of the conundrums of trying to figure out Nancy Reagan. You're right. I mean, she makes a lot of mistakes. She makes mistakes in the governor's mansion in California, and especially in the first 2 years of the Reagan administration. She thought she'd be greeted like Jackie Kennedy. So she, when Jackie Kennedy redecorated the White House, she gives a big television tour and wins an Emmy for it. What Nancy Reagan doesn't realize is, number one, this ain't Camelot. And number two, it's not a real smart thing to be doing in the worst recession since the Great Depression, nor is it particularly smart to, and again, she does all this with private money, including a lot of money from some of the same people who had donated to the Kennedy renovation of the White House. It's also not particularly smart to be collecting donations, including from people with business in front of the administration, like the oil industry, to help her buy a new set of china that cost $1,000 a place setting, and then to announce it on the very day that the Reagan administration, which is cutting back on social programs, announces that ketchup will be classified as a vegetable for the school lunch program. Right. So she does these things. Oh, the other thing she does is she does something common in Hollywood, borrows designer clothing and doesn't give it back. Ultimately, as the Reagans are leaving office, this catches the attention of the IRS, which presents them with a tax bill for $3 million in unreported gifts. But she just keeps making these mistakes over and over again. And I think that begins to change at the end of her husband's first year in office, when she begins to understand that she herself has become a liability and a threat to the success of her husband's administration.
So she does what lots of first ladies do, is she finds an issue that she can claim as her own. And she chooses drug prevention, and she comes up with the catchy phrase that, of course, we all remember it for, just say no to drugs. But she's doing it at a time, traveling all around the country promoting this, at a time when the Reagan administration is cutting support for prevention and treatment programs. That's just a tad tone deaf on the policy front.
And also the Reagan administration is treating the scourge of drugs in the country as a law enforcement issue, not a health issue. And so they are incarcerating a lot of people, including we now know, a disproportionate number of men of color.
Right.
I do think the message itself, you do see some really dramatic polling data about how young people's attitudes towards drugs really shifted in the 1980s and then shifted back in the 1990s after she was off the scene. But yes, it was easy to write off as simplistic, as a family-friendly cover for an administration that was cutting back on treatment and prevention programs. But she also did some controversial things within the administration, including at one point, and this is another story Schultz told me, she actually gives a speech at the United Nations that her husband's own administration is dead set against her doing. At that point, they are trying to crack down on foreign suppliers of drugs, and it's becoming a big hot button diplomatic issue with a lot of other countries. And Nancy Reagan stands up at the United Nations and says, wait a minute, if we're going to talk about the campesino in Peru or the poppy grower in Afghanistan, we are also going to have to deal with the investment banker who goes out and scores some cocaine on his lunch hour. Now, one great paradox of all of this, and I have this well documented in the book, is that Nancy Reagan herself had a serious dependence on prescription drugs, serious enough that it was of concern to not one, but two White House physicians. Of course, and it especially escalates after the assassination attempt, where she is just living in terror that there is somebody out there who wants to finish the job that John Hinckley didn't. And so she does become, and a lot of women of her generation in the 50s, if you were a homemaker who was stressed out at home and went to the doctor, he didn't want to hear your problems. He would just hand you some tranquilizers. So she has some issues that start even then. And I think now we understand how dangerous overuse of prescription drugs are. But at the time, if a doctor prescribed something, that wasn't drugs, that was medicine.
Yeah.
And so, I think, again, now we've had the opioid epidemic, we know how dangerous these things are, but I document this well, and this goes right through some bizarre things I uncovered in the 1990s.
Right. It was common among that generation of women. Eunice Kennedy Shriver herself was another one who relied on prescription drugs to get up in the morning and to put herself to sleep at night. And you say in your book that Nancy Reagan was a famous insomniac. So there you go. And let's talk a little bit about the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. You say that it heightened her anxiety level, as obviously it would to anyone. But she finds an interesting path to reassure herself about his scheduling, for instance, that which day is a better day for the president to be going out in public or to be holding a press conference. And that gets her into a lot of public relations trouble. Talk about her commitment to Her Astrologer.
Sure. Well, first of all, this is a woman with lifelong anxiety issues and fear of abandonment that goes back to her childhood, where her mother, an actress, actually does abandon her for a number of years. And certainly when 2 months into his presidency, where Ronald Reagan comes much closer to death than the country realized at the time, that seems to sort of confirm her belief that no matter how charmed your life is, that the bottom could drop out at any moment. And I really tried to walk the reader through minute by minute by minute what that day was like for her. But where Ronald Reagan had a religious faith, he instilled in him by his mother, Nellie, that he believed that if God preserved him, it was because God had a purpose for him. And so he was able to sort of find some peace after this. Nancy Reagan's beloved adopted father was an atheist. I mean, she was really not raised with that kind of faith. Both Reagans had been interested in astrology going back to the 40s and 50s, as many people in Hollywood were. I mean, it's a superstitious profession. Mm-hmm. So shortly after the assassination attempt, she's just at her wit's end, just terrified every time her husband sets foot outside the White House. She's talking to Merv Griffin, another astrology buff. He's a big, you probably remember him from his talk show, big entertainment executive. The two of them not only share an interest in astrology, they share a July 6th birthday. And Merv Griffin tells her, there's this woman out in California who knew that March 30th was going to be a dangerous day for the president. At which point, Nancy hangs up the phone and calls up Joan Quigley, this astrologer, and puts her on, I think it was a $3,000 a month retainer. This is, the fact that was Joan Quigley influencing policy? No, but she was influencing a lot of scheduling decisions. And in the first term, Michael Deaver, Deputy Chief of Staff, helps keep this a secret. People around the White House don't understand why the scheduling operation is just always a mess. Why Deaver insists that on this foreign trip, Air Force One has to take off at 2:12 a.m. from Andrews Air Force Base. And if the press asks why, we'll just say it's because of jet lag. But in the second term, Deaver is burned out. He leaves, has to turn it over to, and by the way, James Baker told me he knew about this when he was chief of staff, but he just sort of decided, let's leave this with Deaver. I don't need to know too much about it. Right. But in the second term, she has major collisions with White House Chief of Staff Ronald Reagan, ultimately gets him fired. In 1988, in the final months of the Reagan administration, he comes out with a book where he blows the lid off this whole bizarre relationship with this astrologer, which really seems almost too wacky to believe.
And Nancy learns the fundamental law of life in Washington is that if you come after me, I'm coming after you too.
Exactly.
right? And so it's bizarre that she's scheduling the president's, takeoff times on Air Force One. But as you say, it's not like it influences policy. There's another area, though, of public policy that's not exactly her shining moment, or the Reagan administration's shining moment. Of course, early in the 1980s, the AIDS epidemic begins to take off. It's a while before we understand the cause of this disease. We identify the virus. The president says nothing, year after year after year, until Rock Hudson dies. And Rock Hudson's death shakes Nancy and Ronald Reagan, apparently. It's understandable, wouldn't you say, for the public to really question her commitment when she allows this pandemic to take so many lives before she exerts any influence with her husband. And when she does, it takes years before he even mentions the word AIDS in public.
He does not say the word AIDS until his second term. Now, mind you, both of the Reagans have come up in Hollywood. They have surrounded. It's a culture where there are a lot of gay people. Nancy's godmother was a woman named Alla Nazimova, at the time the most famous silent screen actress in the world. She was a lesbian. Mm-hmm. Nancy's first fiance, she breaks up with him because he turns out to be gay. So it isn't like the Reagans are not part of this milieu in Hollywood. In the late 1970s, Reagan surprises everyone by coming out against a ballot initiative in California that everyone thought was going to pass, that would have prevented gays from teaching in the public school system. Reagan comes out against it. It goes down. The whole national movement dies. But I did uncover really quite a bit of homophobia within the White House. Nancy Reagan, in part because she is the daughter of a doctor, in part because her son, Ron, is dancing with the Joffrey Ballet and therefore is part of the arts world in New York and is seeing this scourge up close, she becomes sort of more attuned to this earlier than her husband does. And Ron told me, that he and his mother would sort of try and get this into his father's head, that this was a real problem and that he needed to do something about it. But it is really very belatedly in the administration where Ronald Reagan even gives his first speech. I mean, he doesn't even say the word AIDS until his second term. It takes him until 1987 to give a speech. At that point, and this speech is in front of AMFAR, an organization run by Nancy Reagan's good friend going back to MGM, Elizabeth Taylor. But by then, she does not want to trust this speech to the West Wing, which is run by a lot of ideologues. At one point, Pat Buchanan is the communications director. But people don't remember the types of things that people were saying publicly about homosexuality. At one point, William F. Buckley, the intellectual lion of the conservative movement, writes a column where he suggests that people who are HIV positive should be tattooed on their arms if they are drug users and on their buttocks if they are gay. I mean, people would say things like that publicly. These were, it's astonishing. So she ultimately goes out, gets her own speechwriter to write this speech. It doesn't go as far as it should have, but in the speechwriting files of the Reagan Library, I saw the incredible arguments that were going on behind the scenes, where the social conservatives in the president's orbit were saying, we need to make it clear this is a moral issue, not a health issue. And ultimately, the speechwriter Landon Parvin is able to dial it back, in part because in these arguments, he says, this is how the first lady wants it. And then when Reagan finally, again, belatedly appoints a top-level commission to look at AIDS, it is because of Nancy Reagan's insistence that there be at least one openly gay expert on this commission that one is appointed. And at that point, people like Gary Bauer, the domestic policy advisor, Gordon Humphrey, the conservative senator from New Hampshire, are objecting to even having one openly gay person on this commission, saying, this is not an administration that should be giving out jobs based on people's bedroom habits. I mean, just the bigotry within the administration. Again, I think I have uncovered a lot of things that really show it in a light that I think it had not been understood before.
I think that's right. I mean, there was certainly revelations in there that I had not seen before. But you look at Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan's relationship and her enormous influence with him. She couldn't crack this. She couldn't get through the notion that he really held that this was a moral issue. I mean, at one point he says, perhaps this is God's punishment for aberrant behavior. That was not an uncommon point of view at the time on the religious right. She may not have shared it, but she had more success convincing him to deal with Gorbachev than she had convincing him to deal with AIDS.
Absolutely. And this is, again, a scar on his legacy that is never going to be erased.
She had a lot more success on the one scandal that threatened to consume his presidency. And that's the IranContra Scandal, which I remember very well as it was unfolding at the time, and remembering Reagan's confused response to the scandal. Maybe you could run through that with us and talk about how she actually winds up rescuing his presidency that could have really foundered on that scandal.
Yeah, I think in some ways the Iran-Contra chapter is the heart of the book, because it starts to break at the end of 1986. Mind you, 2 years before, Ronald Reagan has been reelected with 49 states voting for him. If you could even imagine any politician today winning 49 states. But as the scandal, it involves partly trading U.S. arms to America's enemy, Iran, in exchange, essentially as ransom payments for hostages, U.S. citizens who are being held hostage in the Middle East. And then the money is diverted in violation of U.S. law to the Contras, the right-wing forces that were fighting in Central America against the Nicaragua Sandinista government. Ronald Reagan, perpetual optimist, number one, does not believe he has done anything wrong. He, as he always does, believes this is all going to work out fine. It is really Nancy Reagan who understands the jeopardy that he is in. The Senate has just flipped over to the Democrats, which means there's going to be a huge investigation, and that impeachment is a very real possibility. And so begins a very, very tense few months in the Reagan marriage. As Nancy Reagan, unsure who in the West Wing was in on this plot, the CIA director, William Casey, this rogue lieutenant colonel named Oliver North, she doesn't know who to trust. She understands her husband is in great danger. He doesn't believe, that this calls for firing people. So they go at it over her insistence. Ultimately, she wins. That the entire White House staff needs to be shaken up, and the first person that needs to go is Chief of Staff Don Regan. At one point, Reagan says it gets to the point where he would pick up his phone and he'd hear Nancy's voice on the other end of the line saying, "Oh, Dawn, are you still here?" So she gets that done. And again, having to fight with her husband every step of the way. I mean, at one point, their executive assistant tells me he's at Camp David and he hears Reagan scream at her, "Get off my goddamn back." Mm-hmm. Beyond that, what she does, just as important, maybe even more important, because this really is the first time the country that so loved Ronald Reagan has decided they can't trust him anymore. She gets him, she once again, the number of times she goes out and finds her own speechwriter because she doesn't trust the West Wing to get it right. He's going to have to give a televised address. She recruits the speechwriter and she starts this effort to get her husband to the point where he can admit to the country and, just as importantly, admit to himself that he has traded arms for hostages, that he has essentially made ransom payments. And this involves, I didn't realize there's a sort of semi-secret tunnel that goes from the Treasury Department into the East Wing. And she was literally having people brought in through this tunnel. And the independent investigation, the first one, was led by former Senator John Tower of Texas. And she brings in Tower through this tunnel. I spoke to the only two other people who were in the room besides the Reagans and Tower, then the only two living people who were there, who described this scene. And again, mind you, this is an independent investigatory body. You should not be bringing the head of it in to meet with the president. Right. But Tower starts to explain to the president, you are in a lot of trouble here. People could go to jail. Right. And Tower is so overcome that he starts sobbing. At which point, Ronald Reagan stands up and does something extraordinarily graceful to this person who has just laid out practically an indictment against him, right. Which is Ronald Reagan gets up and thanks John Tower for his service to the country.
But the mystery, of course, for the American people is, how does Ronald Reagan not know that that the arms that were traded, even if he didn't think technically it was a trade, that they went to the Contras? It was not like in the 1980s. The newspaper headlines were full of passage of the law that said we are not going to militarily support the Contras in Nicaragua. You and I believe, wrote that story right. Every other week when we were covering the Hill. So that it wasn't a surprise. I mean, one thing
But his management style, famously, he was a delegator. I mean, he didn't sweat the details. He felt like you hired good people and then you trusted them. Nancy Reagan came at things from the opposite point of view. For her, trust was a precious and very perishable right. commodity to
What did you find of the suspicion that was voiced then and has been voiced since, that Ronald Reagan's confusion about this maybe was attributable to the early onset of the disease that finally took him, Alzheimer's?
I think that if that was true, the signs were extremely subtle. You can see in a little bit of his handwriting in that period, not before and not after, it looks a little bit different. But I've got to tell you, certainly it was the opinion of every single White House physician and everybody. You look at his diaries, which are handwritten, you really don't see any change in the clarity of his thoughts, not really a change in his handwriting. I am not an expert, but I did as well as I could sort of laid out for the reader all the signs that were there, all the signs that weren't there. Nancy Reagan always blamed not the disease itself, but the speed with which it progressed on a fall he took from a horse in 1989. I went to every Alzheimer's expert I could find and, was told, yeah, we're looking and trying to figure out if blows to the head make a difference. Right. But really it is in the early 1990s that Reagan begins to become very clearly, not knowing where he is, not recognizing people he's known for decades. I mean, one problem with figuring all of this out with Ronald Reagan is that he was never good on details. He was never
names and those things. Absolutely.
At one point in the 1960s, he is the graduation speaker at his own son's high school. And he turns to Michael Reagan and says, "Hello, I'm Ronald Reagan." At which point his son, this is the 1960s, whips off his mortarboard and says, "Dad, it's me." So,
well, actually, it wouldn't, given your description of the Reagans as parents, it wouldn't shock me if maybe he didn't recognize his own children. I mean, could you talk a little bit about the love story here? People did mock her mercilessly for that adoring gaze that she was always photographed looking at her husband. But it was certainly reciprocal. One of the things you write that is so moving is about these love letters that he wrote to her that just are extraordinary. But it was almost this love affair almost excluded their children from what I took away from your book.
It excluded everybody. They were so closely bound together. There really wasn't any room for anyone else. And really, certainly the damage it did to their children is it's the collateral damage of their great love story. So Nancy Reagan comes from a very traumatic childhood, constantly yearning for security, stability. They meet in 1949. The story of how it comes about is in the book. But this is a point in Ronald Reagan's life. He too, son of an alcoholic, traumatic childhood. His first wife has walked out on him, essentially because she's gotten bored with him. His movie career is coming to an end. He shows up for their first supposedly blind date on Nancy's doorstep, literally a broken man. He is leaning on canes because he's been in traction for 2 months because his leg was broken in 6 places in a charity baseball game. I mean, it is quite literally the low point of his life. He says his heart was in what he described as a deep freeze. Certainly no one could possibly have imagined the future that lay ahead for these two fading movie people.
Right, a B-movie people,
right,
for what it's worth.
But Reagan would say, if Nancy Davis hadn't come along when she did, I would have lost my soul. Wow. But it isn't like this is a really smooth romance. I mean, he is like not easy to pin down. At one point,
doesn't his mother give her some advice because he seems so elusive? She's clearly in love with him, and we don't know about him.
Right. His mother, Nellie, says to Nancy, Nellie likes Nancy a lot better than she liked Jane Wyman. But she does say to Nancy, she says, I can see you're in love with him, but he is not in love with you, not yet. You are just going to have to wait him out. But I do think that if anybody ever doubted the true sincerity of that gaze, right, that she fixed on him for all of those years, those doubts are erased when he develops Alzheimer's. And her stoicism, her devotion to him, for the last 10 years of his life, she becomes not only the caretaker of his physical well-being and his dignity, but also the shaper of his legacy. Mm-hmm. She, pours herself into the library. She does not trust people on the right who would use her husband's name and image for their own reasons. I mean, at one point, she opposes an effort by Republicans in Congress to ditch FDR off the dime and put Ronald Reagan on it. But she also, importantly, because there are still people in liberal elite academic circles and political circles who think he's an amiable dunce, as Clark Clifford said. So she makes sure that his diaries that he kept as president in his own handwriting are released, that a half century of his correspondence, not just with world leaders, but even the woman who ran one of his fan clubs, who he stayed in touch with for something like 50 years. Mm-hmm. She also makes sure that almost an accidental discovery at the library is this big box of handwritten speeches he had given in the years before he was elected president. And in these speeches, you could see that his philosophy of governance was fully formed when he came to office, that he was not just some actor reading lines that somebody else wrote for him. And in many ways, people just told me over and over and over again that his place in history mattered a lot more to her even than it did to him.
Mm-hmm. Again, I think of Bobby Kennedy and him trying to shape his brother's legacy as well after Jack Kennedy's assassination. Could I ask you just a question about your research? You had wonderful access to material. Their biographers of Ronald Reagan opened their files to you. You dug deep into the Reagan library there. What was that like? Was it, were you stumbling on things that you never expected to see?
Stumbling around kind of describes much of this process for me. And, Eileen, as you or anybody else who's ever done research in a presidential library knows, there's stuff they have to show you because the National Archives has deemed it to be in the public domain. Mm-hmm. There is stuff that is deemed personal, and you kind of have to negotiate with the foundation. I never did get a hold of something I wanted, which were all of Nancy Reagan's letters back and forth with Prince Charles. Oh. Which I've told are pretty juicy. Yeah. But, and I remember at one point, they bring out this just big box of stuff that it just is labeled, from the residence on St. Cloud. This is the Reagan's last residence. I don't know if it was taken out before Nancy died or after, but it's just this random jumble of stuff. Mm-hmm. And in it, I find, and it was clear to me that it had been filed, but nobody had ever really read through it. There's a letter written in pencil by Nellie Reagan in 1911, the year her son is born. But there is also a 4-page letter that Ronald Reagan writes to Nancy's father as he is on his deathbed. It's on White House stationery, handwritten, not a word crossed out, in which Ronald Reagan is begging his father-in-law to accept Christ before he dies. And in these 4 pages, you really see his religious faith, I think, spelled out with more clarity than I had ever seen it anywhere. So you do sort of stumble around. I think if I ever do anything that involves a presidential library again, mm-hmm. the first thing I'm going to ask for is the speech writing files. Uh-huh. Because all of the big internal arguments play out as different advisors are arguing over every single word that comes out of the president's mouth. I mean, someday, big speech tonight from Joe Biden.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. That's right. We'll find out after he's left office what the debate was about tonight. This is probably, I don't know if anybody else in the audience cares about this, but I have to ask, because it struck me from page 1 to the very end of your book. You refer to them as Ronnie and Nancy. That is obviously a conscious decision. I mean, we think of them as President Reagan or Ronald Reagan, but you call them Ronnie and Nancy throughout. So how did you come to that?
Well, in partly because there were so many people named Reagan in my book, but I really did want to give people the sense that they were seeing this through her eyes, and this marriage, this man, this life. And I can tell you, if you want to get into the truly, so there are dozens and dozens of just really emotional and in some cases hot and sort of sexual letters that he writes to her, and he has all these nicknames for her, including back into the 1950s, where he would refer to her as Nancy Poo Pants. My husband dared me to make that the title of the book, but I decided not to.
I think that was a good choice. That was a good choice. I want to switch now and let the audience ask questions, because they're coming in on my phone here, and there's quite a lot of them. Someone asks if you could speak more to Nancy Reagan's relationship with her children. We know it was problematic. We know there was huge breaks when they didn't speak. Talk about her as a mom.
Sure. I mean, she herself would say, all I ever wanted, writes in her own memoir, all I ever wanted was to be a good wife and a good mother, and I guess I succeeded more at one than the other. And the dedication to her book is to Ronnie, who always understood, and to my children, who I hope will understand. This is a blended family, 2 kids from the first marriage, 2 kids from the second marriage. They were anything but the Brady Bunch. The kids are rebellious. She is not very well equipped. I mean, Ronald Reagan is the center of her existence. She is the center of his existence, and the kids really do suffer. And this goes, Ron has different memories from his sister Patty. I mean, there was physical abuse in the house, though this was the 50s. And Ron said, we weren't like Jane Wyman. She used to beat Michael and Maureen with a riding crop. But there was, just the sort of the degree to which the kids just were excluded from this relationship. And it really continues right up to the end of Ronald Reagan's life, where Nancy, who's constantly worried about money, and she's had breast cancer. Her husband, while he has Alzheimer's, is physically very strong. She's afraid he is going to outlive her. So she cuts the kids off. Now, mind you, none of the 4 Reagan kids graduated from college. So the kids themselves are all sort of...
That's interesting. I mean, she's a Smith College graduate. It's something she obviously valued. Her stepfather sent her to college, wanted her to succeed in that way. She didn't demand that of her kids.
Ron drops out of Yale because he wants to dance ballet. The rest of them also, they're just sort of trying to find their own way. But I mean, they're all sort of living in the shadow of this epic figure. One tiny detail is that when Michael, the son with Jane Wyman from his first marriage, gets married for the first time in Hawaii, mm-hmm. Ronald and Nancy Reagan decide that they instead that day are going to be at Tricia Nixon's wedding in Washington.
Ouch.
I mean, just think about that.
Ouch. Ouch.
By the way, it turns out this was not a very well-advised match. So anyway.
Well, maybe her astrologer had predicted that. And so she thought, no, I'll wait for the next wedding because that one might stick. Another member of our audience asks a good question that you would ask if you had watched Nancy Reagan over the years, whether she had an eating disorder.
Oh, okay. But when she was in college, her weight ballooned up to around 150 pounds. At Smith, in the house where she lived, they would set out peanut butter and jelly sandwiches at night, she would take 4 of them.
Mhm.
And her father gives her this big lecture about losing weight. But I think that in many ways her weight becomes a barometer of her anxiety. And at really stressful times, what little weight she had falls off. I mean, she would get down below 100 pounds. She doesn't want her husband to run for re-election in 1984, in part because she is so terrified about his the physical danger of him risking another 4 years. Her weight drops so far that a rumor goes around that she's seriously ill and the stock market crashes, that, this is going to keep him from running again.
Wow.
So yes, her weight is very clearly, and she in the 50s was addicted to diet pills, which, those are uppers, which means at night you have to take downers. And so
it puts you on this cycle.
One columnist wrote that she had piano legs. She was very, very self-conscious of her legs and would do exercises to sort of trim them down.
Wow. So we talked about AIDS, and we talked about how she missed a moment there to really influence her husband, but maybe she couldn't have because of his bigotry or his religious beliefs about homosexuality at that time. But she did veer away from those strict religious beliefs that he held once he got sick with Alzheimer's. And she became a voice for stem cell research that keeps getting curtailed by Republican presidents. Can you talk about that, like her advocacy on that front?
That's correct. She is actually quite fond of George W. Bush, unlike her battles with other members of the Bush family take up quite a bit of the book. But
I should ask you to talk about just how much you did not like Barbara Bush.
Right.
That comes through loud and clear.
Yeah, Barbara could dish it out as well as take it though. But anyway, but she likes George W. Bush, and astrology here, he too was born on July 6th.
Right.
So, but he is making a very big decision early in his presidency over whether lines of stem cells at the National Institutes of Health, which involve the destruction of fetal tissue, can be used for research. And she implores him privately to reconsider this decision. He doesn't. So finally, when once again there is pressure on him to open up stem cell research, she gets up at a dinner honoring Michael J. Fox, who was suffering from Parkinson's, another advocate of stem cell research, and she announces her position on it. Mm-hmm. The right goes berserk. And one congressman calls up her longtime advisor, Michael Deaver, and says, Ronald Reagan would never support this, to which Deaver replies, Ronald Reagan hasn't had to take care of Ronald Reagan for the last 10 years. And I do think this is very close to her husband's death. She knows this can't possibly help him.
But it could help the legions that are suffering with Alzheimer's. And Ronald Reagan's political advisors certainly know that when he was governor of California, he liberalized the abortion laws in that state long before Roe v. Wade. So right. People evolve in their thinking on these issues. So
and she announced, by the way, in 1994 that while she opposed abortion, she thought it should be a woman's choice.
Right. So seems like a specious argument to give her in return.
It's the Cuomo position.
I love this question because it's asked so politely. It's asked if you could characterize Nancy Reagan's relationship with Frank Sinatra. And everybody wants to know was she sleeping with Frank Sinatra?
Oh, I mean, I can't imagine that was true. It just,
they were incredibly close though. Yes.
they were. And my favorite story about Frank Sinatra from the book was told to me by Fred Fielding, who was White House counsel. Yes, she had a huge crush on him. I asked her stepbrother about it. He said, yeah, but the one we all really laughed about was she had a huge crush on George Will. Anyway, so Deaver goes to Fred Fielding and tells the White House counsel, Nancy and Sinatra are cooking up this idea where he should be given a position in the Reagan administration, like overseeing the arts or something. Well, given Sinatra's longtime rumored ties to the mob, the underworld, this is like causes great alarm.
Mm-hmm.
So Fielding says, send him over to my office. Sinatra walks in and Fred Fielding says, Mr. Sinatra, we are so pleased that you want to give your service to the government. In fact, we are so pleased about this that I personally will walk your background check through the FBI. At which point, Fielding told me Michael Deaver is like trying to contain his laughter in the room. And that was the last they heard of Frank Sinatra's interest in coming into the government.
So Frank decided, no, he'll be her confidant on the side. Never mind an official position. Someone else asks, who are the women in her life or in the country that inspired her or influenced her?
Well, I think Jackie Kennedy. One of her misconceptions is that a lot of the things that she would do that were so stylish would be received the way Jackie Kennedy's were. Mm-hmm. And one thing that was sort of interesting is, so in the middle of all this, there's a blow up over her redecorating the White House. Things are blowing up over the China. At one point, she gets a letter from Jackie Kennedy, and Jackie Kennedy writes her, you're going to get through this. This will all blow over. But in the meantime, you may not want to look at the newspapers.
Good idea. Just don't read what your critics have to say. But so Jackie's an inspiration. What about her relationship with her mom? I mean, her mother was an actress, like she herself was an actress. You talked a little bit about this strained beginning when the mother left her with relatives before she married her second husband. How did that relationship evolve over time?
So these years of abandonment really do, as their son Ron told me, leave a shadow on Nancy's spirit that never really lifts. She is anxious for the rest of her life, fears of abandonment. Mm-hmm. But Edith Davis meets this neurosurgeon in a 1927 trip to England on a ship. They have sort of a shipboard fling. I mean, imagine a neurosurgeon in 1927. This is a very young field. Yeah. She goes to Bethesda, Maryland, where her daughter is living with relatives, and announces she's getting married, moving to Chicago. She's taking Nancy with her. They're all going to be together. Now, Nancy still, for the next at least 8 years, is not adopted by this stepfather she adores. She has to engineer her own adoption when she's a teenager, mm-hmm. Which is a pretty remarkable thing in and of itself. But as brilliant as her adoptive father was, it really is Edith Davis who engineers their rise through Chicago society. She's a networker extraordinaire. I mean, political figures are coming through the house. Spencer Tracy is there all the time, Lillian Gish, Walter Houston. And as her stepbrother told me, you really can see in the pattern of the Davis marriage the patterns that would eventually be seen in the Reagan marriage. It really is Nancy who is the networker, the one who builds a lot of the scaffolding for their rise.
Well, tell us a little bit about the relationship with Barbara Bush and why it went so sour. And it went sour just about immediately, did it not?
Well, Nancy didn't like the Bushes much at all, period. And don't forget, there was a very bitter fight for the Republican nomination in 1980. And as George Will told me, sometimes it's easier for the principals to let go of the bitterness than it is for the spouses. And certainly Barbara Bush never lets Nancy forget whose husband she thinks ought to be sitting in the Oval Office and who ought to be attending funerals of foreign leaders. Mm-hmm. But I think there was a lot about Barbara Bush that triggered Nancy Reagan's insecurities. Barbara Bush, where Nancy is seen as coming out of this kind of parvenu culture of Hollywood, Barbara Bush has roots that go back to the Mayflower. Barbara Bush has a closet full of designer clothes, and yet she is just bathed in glowing coverage as America's grandmother. People just love her. I think, too, in the very close-knit, functional Bush family, is such a contrast to the Reagans. The kids are around, the grandkids are around. So the number of sort of slights between these two women are just amazing, how much they can't stand each other.
Right.
But there is at one point, Barbara Bush is on Air Force Two. Bush is starting to run for president himself, and she goes back to the back of the plane where the reporters are all sitting and does this absolutely brutal imitation of Nancy Reagan. And Lou Cannon, who's there for the Washington Post, says to her, he says, Mrs. Bush, Mrs. Reagan has eyes and ears everywhere. This is going to get back to her. To which Barbara Bush replies, I know.
So she is undaunted by the prospect that Nancy's going to get angry about this. Well, I think it speaks a little to that insecurity that you're talking about, too. Didn't Smith College give Barbara Bush an honorary degree?
Yes. And Barbara Bush dropped out her freshman year to get married. Nancy Reagan actually graduated. And in 1982, and I found in the Smith College files, when Nancy's really having a rough go of it, her social secretary, Muffy Brandon, herself a Smith graduate. By the way, it is, again, this is Smith College at a time women didn't go there to set themselves on a path to careers. And a year ahead of Nancy was a Betty Friedan, who would later write The Feminine Mystique. But anyway, so in 1982, the White House kind of gingerly suggests, wouldn't you like to have the first lady on campus and you could maybe give her an honorary degree? At which point Smith College just says, as much as we'd like to honor her, we're a little afraid of the kind of protests we would have on campus. So they don't do that. And then, of course, yes, they do honor Barbara Bush. And then they come back afterwards. Nancy's out of office by then and says, now, you want to come and we'll do something for you? And she goes, no.
No, thank you. Interesting, because neither of them were exactly poster women for the feminist movement, right?
Right. And a lot of the coverage, the roughest coverage of Nancy Reagan actually was young female reporters. And as Katharine Graham, the owner of the Washington Post, close friend of Nancy Reagan, explains to her, you represent everything they're rebelling against.
Right.
But after Iran-Contra, you suddenly see this shift where it's these women writers who are going, this woman came through for her husband when all the smart guys around him wouldn't and couldn't. And all of a sudden, it's some of the conservative male writers who like their first ladies in a more traditional mold, who turn on her. And William Safire in the New York Times writes, Nancy Reagan's just an incipient Edith Wilson, unelected, trying to run the country. And I forget whether it was him or James Reston, one of the two of them on the op-ed page of the New York Times actually uses the word henpecked to describe Ronald Reagan.
Love it, love it, love it, love it. 1980s. We had come so far.
Right.
One of our other audience members asked about what do you think about her relationship and Ronald Reagan's relationship with Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House? I mean, we live in a time now where one party demonizes the other, and we never expected that the Trump White House would be hosting Speaker Pelosi socially. The stories back then were that they played poker together and that they were great pals. Was that your impression?
Absolutely. Both of the Reagans, you read it in their memoirs, you read it in their diaries, were extremely fond of Tip O'Neill. Personally, Nancy Reagan writes that one of her strongest memories of Inauguration Day in 1981 is the luncheon afterward, where her mother, Edith Davis, and Tip O'Neill sit there just swapping stories and having a great time. I do think, this was an era when people could have differences politically and not you just assume that differing over a political question makes you an evil person.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the role of first ladies has changed even since Nancy Reagan?
I think that every first lady has to figure this out for herself. There's no job description. There is no portfolio. Some of them, like Hillary Clinton, will take on entire policy areas, as she did with healthcare.
And that worked out very well.
Yes, exactly.
As we all remember.
And Eleanor Roosevelt was literally her husband's legs. I mean, getting around the country and seeing things that he was physically incapable of doing. You certainly had a lot of very traditional ones along the way. Betty Ford was a real path breaker. Interestingly, she's another one who she and Nancy had just couldn't stand each other. And at one point, Betty Ford says during the 76th convention, when her husband barely pulls out the nomination against Reagan, Betty Ford says, "Oh, Nancy Reagan, she used to be a career girl, but then she met Ronnie and she just fell apart."
There you go. I mean, because of course we remember Betty Ford as being outspoken and being somebody that was influenced by the women's movement in the 1970s. She becomes almost beloved by the time Ronald Reagan dies because of that loyalty. And because Alzheimer's is such a scourge in the country, more and more people know what it takes to be the caregiver of somebody with this degenerative disease. Now, I don't suspect for a minute that she's caring for him as a nurse, but she has that emotional burden and handles it with grace. So does it change the opinions of so many Americans who were disdainful of her because of her inaction on AIDS, because of her sense of entitlement and her fancy clothes?
I think that in witnessing her devotion and her stoicism during that terrible last decade of her husband's life, for the first time, Americans actually begin to look at Nancy Reagan and think of the word strength, which is something that I think they would never have applied to her before.
Right. But if you read your book, in which we encourage all of our members of the audience to do, you'll see that that spine, that rigid steel spine, is there all throughout, despite the anxiety, despite the reliance on pills, despite the insecurity. When it comes to Ronald Reagan, she's single-minded in a way that can only be a sign of strength.
Yeah, and there is a real clarity there where her husband's interests are concerned. And again, paradoxically, not one we see where her own image is concerned.
Right, concerned. Well, I can't thank you enough for doing this with us, Karen. It's been a wonderful evening to have this conversation with you. I want to thank our audience for joining us. We are so sorry that this is still virtual because, as we all know, it's much more fun to be sitting in the Stephen Smith room with that beautiful backdrop of Boston Harbor behind us, having conversations with authors like Karen Tumulty. So good night and good evening to all of you. And thank you again, Karen.
Oh, thank you so much, Eileen.
Okay, take care.